I think it's pretty solid advice.
Groups of cells in different parts of your brain, they're all connected.
The statistics just don't back it up. There's nothing here.
Any complex life you find has mitochondria.
We have discovered things from athletes juicing.
My name is Matt Kaberlein, and welcome to the Optispan podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. I'm thrilled to have Mike Mutzel come down to Optispan HQ this morning. So thanks for making your way down through traffic this morning. I know it can be tough in Seattle at this time of day, but really looking forward to having you on the podcast. Lots of stuff I want to talk about. I know you're planning to do both a DEXA and a VO2 max assessment with Nick when we're done. So I'm just wondering, do you have any numbers that you're shooting for or hoping to hit on those?
Matt, great question. So when I turned 40, I wanted to do my VO2 max every year to see if I can sort of offset some of the age-related losses in aerobic capacity as well as muscle loss changes and things like that. So when I turned 40, my VO2 max was 49. I can't remember the units. And then when I turned 41, it was 54. So I don't know if I could maintain 54 or 55, that'd be great.
That's great.
So I haven't changed my body mass or my body weight in the last year. I started how I stay fit throughout the year is a combination of HIIT training during the winter season here in Seattle, as folks might know. It gets pretty dark and rainy and things like that. It's hard to get out and do a lot of hiking, which is my primary form of aerobic activity. I lift weights 3 to 5 days per week. So I'll do HIIT training in the winter, and then during the summer and spring, I like to hike, and in the fall. So my girlfriend and I went to Europe in June, so we did a lot of like early season hiking and things around Chamonix and Mount Blanc and things like that. Did a lot of overnight backpacking trips in July and August here in Western Washington. So it'll be interesting to see if that Zone 2 training will translate into an improved VO2 max this year compared to last year.
Yeah, and have you been doing the HIIT training as well recently? Or
not so much. So that's the thing. So it's been more, well, I could, hiking or backpacking could, some of the
depending
areas,
on the hike and
how steep. Sure. We've been in some really steep country in the Glacier Peak Wilderness area. So haven't done any official like Zone 2. I mean, I have a ski erg and Concept 2 at my house. So I'll do some 20-second, 30-second intervals, like 4 or 5 sets. Yeah. And I look at the wattage. And so my wattage that I would normally put out during like Zone 2 training in a CrossFit type class is on par. So it'll be,
So I think if I understand correctly, you would say you haven't necessarily been training for VO2 max, but you've been doing a fair amount of cardio exercise and resistance training, and so we'll see where you're at.
Yeah, it'll be super interesting, because there is I know Peter Attia, who you a great friend of yours and so forth, has talked a lot about Zone 2. So it'll be interesting to see if just like unofficially, by just recreational activity, hiking, right, and walking, without trying to be intentional about sitting on an exercise bike and doing like 190 watts for 40 minutes, how that carries over to an improved VO2 max.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is actually an important discussion topic, right? Which is, I think there are some people who they can be very motivated, and I think Peter probably falls in this camp, to be very regimented. I am training this way. I'm going to track everything, and my goal is to get my VO2 max or whatever to this point, right? Other people like me, that doesn't work for. Like that is not the kind of thing that motivates me to go out and be active. Like I want to do something that I enjoy, that's fun. I love to hike like you do, be outside. So I think part of it is finding, what is going to work for you. And I'm a little bit, I would say, uncertain how much more effective the sort of dedicated training for VO2 max is for the goal of getting your VO2 max up, but also for the goal of just being more generally healthy and well-rounded. Again, I think it's gonna be individual, but I think also just thinking about it and recognizing what works for you is really, really important. So.
Totally. No, I agree. And for me, it's more functional. I want to be able to take my daughter into the backcountry. And this last weekend, we did a 21-mile loop, right? And so it's like, I want to be able to do that, carrying a 70-pound pack and feel good. And like,
and your daughter went with you?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And
awesome.
Actually, and her friend, and her friend, we introduced him to hiking and things earlier this summer. And he hadn't done much. He plays football and baseball. He's an elite athlete. He's really talented, especially hand-eye coordination. But we really pushed him. And we were in the backcountry at night and had our headlamps on, going over ridges and stuff. So it was a lot of fun for them, just seeing them off screens.
Very cool.
Just enjoying the simple little things. We found these really cool crystals and these great rocks, and they put them in their packs. And I'm like, that's going to make it more challenging. But they just wanted to bring them home and share them with their family.
And that's the kind of thing those are memories that they're going to keep for the rest of their lives.
Totally.
So that's awesome. Yeah. So that's great. So anyways, we'll see how your VO2 max comes out. That'll be good. What do you think about DEXA? Have you done DEXAs before? Do you think that's a useful tool?
I do think it's a good tool. Yeah, I've only done 2 before. And I've done also, leading up to that, the bioimpedance testing, the intracellular water. So I think that's more accessible to people, but I think the DEXA is great. There's something about when you see, the DEXA or the MRIs, you can see the visceral fat or the fat. And I think that really helps catalyze lifestyle change for people when they realize that they have fat around the abdomen, in particular because we hear about the harms and people know, it's a kitchen table topic, visceral fat or belly fat is problematic from a health perspective. So I think it's a great visual tool, but it's not something I personally serially do. I just haven't noticed changes in my body composition one direction or the other in the last 10 years. Once I cleaned up my diet and lifestyle, it's been pretty it's been pretty constant.
Yeah. I think DEXA, it's a tool that I really like, and we use at Optispan as part of our programs. But I think, again, it depends a lot on the person, right? There are some people where, especially if you haven't got your nutrition or your exercise in order, it is a very powerful tool. And like you said, I think seeing it is different than seeing the picture is different than seeing a number on a scale, for sure. And the thing that I really like about DEXA for a lot of people is, in addition to estimating body fat and muscle mass, is the bone density piece, which you're not going to get really any other way. And again, for a lot of people, especially women, when you go into your 40s, 50s, 60s, that starts to become really important. So the earlier if you're on a track to low bone density, the better off you are and the steps you can take. So again, I think every tool has its right place.
Absolutely. It's interesting because if you look at the so-called osteosarcopenic obesity, this triad of gaining more body fat, losing muscle mass and bone at the same time. Yeah. So I think a lot of people don't recognize they might be a little bit overweight, they don't exercise, but they don't realize that they're also probably losing muscle and bone. Right. So that information from a DEXA can really help motivate people.
Right. Yeah. So we'll see how it comes out. And
totally.
Then, maybe we'll have you on again and we can talk about your results.
Sure.
So, okay. So we got in the weeds real fast. I have a lot of topics actually that I'm looking forward to talking about, but, one thing I wanted to do, so you got your degree from Western, right?
I did, yeah.
Which I want to give a shout out to Western. I got my degree from Western. Nice. I graduated in 1997.
Cool.
I think you were
06
in biology.
Yes.
So I was in the chemistry department, but biochemistry major. So I had a lot of interactions with the biology department. And
we probably had
knew a lot of people there.
Did you take organic chemistry with James Vivian? Was he a teacher at that?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember who the teachers were. There were three professors in chemistry who were teaching organic chemistry when I was there. I actually don't remember whether Vivian. I think he might have been a little after my time.
Yeah, he was younger.
It's funny how quickly it seems like the turnover is, when in reality, we were almost a decade apart.
Right.
It goes. But actually, one of my former postdocs from my lab at University of Washington is now a professor in the biology department there. Cool. Adrian Wang, who again would be after your time, but hey, Adrian, if you're watching, it's pretty, I loved Western. I don't know what your experience was like.
Great.
I absolutely loved Bellingham, and my youngest son is moving up there right now to start at Western. So it's a great
Super
place.
Cool.
So yeah, small world. And then you went to Connecticut for your master's degree?
Yeah, so University of Bridgeport offers a degree in human clinical nutrition. So it's a little bit different than dietetics. Most master's degrees in nutrition is more dietetics focused. And so the human clinical nutrition at University of Bridgeport is more about, it's just not so much the dietetic focus on macronutrients and calories and things like that, more looking at sort of the functional perspective and things like that, more clinical nutrition, people working one-on-one with someone that has maybe autoimmunity and needs to change their diet. And how I got into that was a mentor of mine, a medical doctor, Gerard Guillory. He needed a lot of support in his practice. He was very busy, did a lot of Medicare, didn't have time or the personnel to train people on what to eat and how to improve their nutrition, because people would come in with high triglycerides, high blood pressure, pre-diabetic or diabetic, and he knew that diet and nutrition is going to move the needle probably as much or more than some of the medications that he would prescribe.
Right.
And so I was working with him because I was selling lab testing at the time for advanced lipoprotein particle testing. So that's how I got into really on a just personal level interest in lipids, seeing changes in lipids and particle size.
When you say you're selling lab testing, how did you get into that?
Yeah, it was just a serendipitous encounter with a company who was at that time competing with Berkeley Heart Lab and the NMR technology. There was three different companies at the time, and so this company SpectraCell was sort of new to the marketplace, and they offered what's called a ultracentrifugation profile. So they would spin, basically, you get a sample of your blood and they would spin it down and you could see actually the direct quantities. You could enumerate all the lipoprotein particles, VLDL, remnant lipoproteins, HDL species, and so forth. And at the time, it was much more accurate than what was out there. There was this vertical auto profile test. I can't remember who was selling it through LabCorp, and it was really inaccurate. Yeah. Then NMR came on the market, and I think LabCorp acquired that. Then Berkeley Heart Labs did a gel electrophoresis, and that was pretty good. Eventually, Quest acquired that, but this technology was really accurate. So it was really cool to work with cardiologists and different, functional medicine doctors and see changes in labs.
So were you doing that right after your undergraduate?
Yeah, exactly.
Before you went to the master's program?
Yeah, so I took the MCAT, wasn't sure if I wanted to go to med school or not. Yeah. Had a serendipitous interaction with then the chief medical officer of Merck, actually at a bar in Boston. And I just took the MCAT and I was so excited. He was like, there's a lot of things you can do in health, but I wouldn't advise going into medicine right now with how Medicare is changing in insurance. And I thought, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
So, and then my mentor, Gerard Guillory, who I became friends with just because I was his rep, was like, yeah, if you get a degree in nutrition, you can work here in the office. And I wanted to work with people. I went to college, wanted to do physical therapy, but I realized there's probably more than just the musculoskeletal aspect of it. So that's a very long-winded way into how I, went and got into.
So did you do actual clinical research as part of your master's?
Not a research. We did we just had to do either write a thesis paper. Yeah. We did a vitamin D study so Gerard worked with the Aurora Fire Department. And so one of the things that we did was he was prescribing vitamin D. He went to a seminar in Boston and met Michael Hollick, who has done a lot of research on vitamin D and was just blown away at all the research. And he realized even in Colorado, he was started to run vitamin D levels on patients in 2005. And it's so sunny. I mean, it's the inverse of Western Washington. We get, I don't know, reliably maybe 100 sunny days a year. In Colorado, it's 300 sunny days a year. But all of majority of his patients were low in 25-hydroxyvitamin D.
Yeah.
And he was blown away that so many people were low in vitamin D. I mean, there's a lot of fear about the sun and skin cancer, and then we need to cover up in sunscreen and all this. And so he started prescribing vitamin D to his patients, just 4,000 IUs per day. And there was multiple studies even back then in Archives of Internal Medicine and JAMA and New England Journal of Medicine finding that vitamin D levels are independently correlated with risk of diabetes and high blood pressure and all these different conditions.
Bunch of stuff. Yeah.
So he started prescribing vitamin D and noticed his patients just felt better. They were sleeping better. They had less mental, issues with anxiety or things like that. And so because he was the physician for this fire department, he thought it would be really cool to do a study where we could randomize people who were his patients to either take vitamin D or not take vitamin D. And what we found is there was significant improvements in just subjective quality of life measurements that are standardized when they took vitamin D compared to not taking vitamin D. And what was interesting is during this period when we were doing this, a lot of the firemen went on this cruise in June. It was like an annual thing that they would normally do. And I think it was listeria or some norovirus, something broke out on the cruise ship. Right. And the people who were in the group that were taking vitamin D didn't get sick compared to I think it was 80% or 90% of the people that were in the control group didn't take vitamin D, got really ill on this cruise ship. So anyway, that was really interesting to me, just seeing this was like 2007, this is early 2000s. Now everyone knows about vitamin D.
Yeah, although, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because there are a pretty vocal group of people out there who sort of are, I guess I would say, vitamin D deniers, right? Like they make the case that supplementation with vitamin D is not the same as getting your vitamin D from the sun, which is true. It's not the same.
Right.
but that there's little to no evidence that supplementation with vitamin D has the same benefits, although they would argue any benefits, and so we shouldn't be supplementing vitamin D. I'm interested, actually, I wasn't planning to talk about this, but given your background, like, I know what my thoughts are on that, but I'm interested in what your thoughts are and where you're at now. So we're now, 15, 20 years later almost than back then.
Right.
What are your thoughts today on vitamin D supplementation?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, because there's a lot of people that have insufficient vitamin D.
Yeah, I mean, like in our program, in our programs, I would say 2/3, and maybe that's not shocking given we're in the Pacific Northwest,
Right.
of people are below 30, which again, I think that's one of the cutoffs that they use for being vitamin D insufficient, right?
Sure.
So 2/3 of the people walking around out there in the Pacific Northwest, let's just say, are insufficient.
Yeah, not surprising. And it's really scary. I think it's a proxy of, yes, we need to increase dietary source, either from mushrooms or just supplemental vitamin D. It's
and sorry to interrupt, but what's the data that you can actually significantly increase vitamin D levels through diet and mushrooms, you said, but like what other sources would be
fatty
fish,
fish liver, but we're not talking about, significant quantities.
Yeah.
That's the thing. I think the best way naturally to increase your vitamin D levels is to get 20 minutes of full body sun exposure per day. But if you live north of Atlanta, Georgia, between the months of October and March, I mean, you're literally, the zenith angle of the sun is insufficient to induce cutaneous synthesis.
Right.
So it is a function of what we probably need to supplement. Again, if you live north of Atlanta, Georgia, which is a significant proportion of the U.S. here.
Or if you don't and you're inside all day because it's too hot to be outside, right?
Exactly. Even in Phoenix, Arizona. I mean, I remember a study that U of A did in Tucson. Tucson's almost near the border of Mexico, 45 minutes. Majority of the students in that study, I can't remember the exact reference here. I could find it if you'd like for the show notes, but majority of the students were low in vitamin D.
Yeah.
Because you said it's hot. So in Arizona, you think, well, gosh, it's sunny all the time. Well, you're indoors during the hot months,
right?
Because it's so hot out. You're in air conditioned. So because of the fear of the sun and wrinkles and all this, many people are insufficient in vitamin D, which means they're not getting sun exposure most likely. And so that, I think we don't have a supplement for the sun. We need to get sun exposure to entrain our body's circadian clock system and for just overall health. But that being said, I think we should still supplement with vitamin D.
Yeah, and I agree. And again, I think this is one of the challenges with nutrition and supplements in general is even things like vitamin supplements. You can find anything in the literature to support any point of view you want to have, right? So you kind of have to say, okay, what does the whole body of work suggest? And also be a little bit pragmatic. And my view is with something like vitamin D or omega-3, where we have good ways to measure it. We have some pretty good estimates of at least what deficient is, even if we don't know exactly what optimal is.
Right.
And if you're deficient, you should probably supplement out of the deficient range, right? I mean, it just seems kind of obvious to me. And yet you have people who, in my view, argue. I don't think it's from the perspective of bad intentions, but I think it has bad consequences because they are being reactive instead of proactive, which I think is a culture that we just have to push back against in healthcare, right? Of, well, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And if you're not sick, we don't need to do anything about it. But if we know you're on the path to getting sick, we should probably fix it earlier. That's at least my take on some of these things.
I agree 100%. And I think it comes down to just the name of it. So if we think it's just a vitamin, and so most mainstream doctors have this perception, and I understand where they come from, because if you look at some of the analysis of vitamins over the counter, various studies will look at just randomly go to Walgreens and buy some multivitamins, and they third-party test them, and they don't have what's on the label. It is not in the bottle.
Right.
So then most doctors are like, look, it's just a vitamin. It's not really that significant. But as you and I both know, I mean, vitamin D is a hormone, and there's nuclear receptors. And so if it was in the same category of DHEA or testosterone, then we would probably consider it differently. But because it's a quote unquote vitamin, we sort of just dismiss it as maybe unimportant.
I think that's a good point. And also I think one thing that makes vitamin D a little bit different from some of the other vitamins as well is that it's not going to be influenced by whether you took a supplement that morning, right? The measurement actually means something about your steady state level over the past weeks or months. And so we actually do have tools where we can diagnose with some degree of precision whether somebody is deficient or not.
Totally.
So yeah, I mean, it's a complicated topic. And again, not something I thought we'd talk about, but worth talking about. And I know a lot of people are aware, but I guess we're both of the opinion that if you're deficient, that you should probably supplement, right?
I agree.
And try to get sun.
No, yeah, do both. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I just did my vitamin D level. I tested on Monday to see, because I didn't supplement all summer, but have been outside a lot. So I'm curious to see, what effect sun exposure does have without supplement.
Actually, what do you view as the range that you're trying to get your vitamin D into?
Yeah, so if we're using the nanograms per milliliter, I think is there's nanomoles per liter, I think, and then nanograms. 65 nanograms per, I believe it's ml. I believe that's the range.
We'll check it out.
I think that's, and this is according to research post-COVID. I mean, this is interesting too, and don't want to get into the politics at all of COVID, but various research studies do find that when individuals' vitamin D levels were around 65 nanograms per ml, they had reduced odds of being hospitalized or having severe disease or dying compared to individuals who had lower vitamin.
I believe it. I mean, it all tracks, right?
Yeah.
This is, again, one of these things. When the arrows from a bunch of different things are all pointing in the same direction, you're right. Maybe it was only one study, but it's plausible. It makes sense.
So I think that's a good, that would be the upper limit, I think. And going into winter where folks would want to have their vitamin, in terms of optimal. And so what does that look like in terms of dosing? Usually around 5,000 to 6,000 IUs per day.
Yeah. But it's going to be very individual. This is something that we've definitely seen is that, 3,000 in one person may do the trick, and somebody else it may take 10,000. So
totally.
This is where I think I push back against the idea that just everyone should supplement. I think the blood tests are available. They're not that expensive. Yeah. If you can at all afford it or get your doctor to give you the test, do the test, measure, then supplement, then measure again.
Agree, 100%. Yeah. And along those lines, there was an interesting study. It was a small study, about 20 subjects, where they randomized people to take, there was a control group, a vitamin D only group, and a vitamin D plus A group in a post-stroke situation. So individuals had, I can't remember the subset of a stroke, but they had a stroke. And they found that pairing vitamin D and A together increased both vitamin D levels and vitamin A levels and reduced interleukin-1 beta. So they're looking at a key cytokine that might be involved in the etiology of having a stroke. And they found that pairing that together. And if you look in nature, you look at egg yolks, or you look at fish liver, cod liver, and so forth, it has both vitamin D and A together. So that might be something as well. If people are having a hard time getting their levels up, they could co-supplement with vitamin A.
Right. Okay. Very interesting. So again, we went down a little bit of a tangent there, which is great. That's part of the fun of being here. But so this all came out of your sort of master's experience.
Right.
And then how did you get from the master's to where you are now? I'm assuming you didn't always intend to end up on the path that you're on now. So what's the story there?
In terms of making videos and things like that, interviewing people. Well, so I was selling the lab testing through SpectraCell. And then I got a job actually selling dietary supplements for practitioners only. So there's a whole retail space, and then there's a doctor-only channel. Yep. A lot of people don't know about it, but it's a $1 billion market. So this company, Zymogen, I started working for them and working with a lot of compounding pharmacists, medical doctors, Jonathan Wright, for example, at Tahoma Clinic, things like that. And had a great time doing that, started doing webinars for the actual doctors, because I realized going door to door selling supplements and working with doctors was challenging, right? You can only see so many people in a day. Why not do webinars? And then I realized that many of these doctors were amazing clinicians and were treating conditions with natural products and lifestyle change, but they're not really good at marketing themselves. I just said, well, how about you and I do a video about what we just talked about, and we'll put it on the internet, and I'll help you with your business. And in so doing, you'll help me with my business. And that's kind of how it started. So in 2012, I started doing these webinars with them and then making videos. And then I realized in 2014, after having my territory switched around a million times, I managed Canada, the Midwest, the Northwest, and my legs kept getting cut off by the powers that be. So I'm like, look, I'm just going to do this full time. So I started podcasting full-time in 2018. And but in my travels, I met with some amazing people, and we would do in-person videos just like this. And so that's kind of how it started.
Cool.
It's been an incredible journey. Just working with different types of doctors of all types, pharmacists, medical doctors, and so forth. You can learn so much about what they're seeing in their practice and what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah. So that's a fantastic sort of story. And I think, again, I wanted to talk about supplements a little later on, but
Sure.
But since you have that experience in the supplement industry, I mean, maybe we could talk a little bit about that, because I have sort of a hard time with supplements. And again, my background is in doing laboratory research in the field of longevity, and I think supplements in the longevity field are particularly challenging for a variety of reasons. But you've sort of seen it from the other side, from the inside in some ways. And I'm interested to just kind of get your thoughts on, supplements in general. What are their role in people's health journeys? How do you sort of evaluate what's real, what's not? And then in the industry, what are some of the positives and negatives that I'm sure you've seen a lot.
Oh yeah. On both sides, sadly more negative than positive. There's a lot of sneaky loopholes and things like that, just with packaging or manufactured on dates versus expiry dates. And that's what gives supplements a bad name. That's the thing, because they can be very powerful.
Yeah.
And I've seen this working with doctors. They get excited to say, hey, look at these labs before and after using these different products and the patient's, success stories. I mean, you see that a lot of that is real. I think some of it is placebo, to be honest, as well. There's a lot of people who have taken, say, Standard Process. This is a huge company that has been around. They're from Wisconsin for, at least 60 years. And this is a multi-generational thing. And people really believe that these different things cure everything from hemorrhoids to hangnails, right? And so they take these products and, their grandmother took it, and then dad took it, and then, their daughter takes it. And so there's a lot of, I think, placebo plays into it, but there is, I think, a lot of value in things. I think the basics are actually pretty effective. There's a lot of esoteric boutique supplements. I mean, we sold resveratrol when it came out. I worked with this Dr. Mark Houston, and we had seminars with him going around. And as you remember, the claims.
Believe me, I remember.
It cured everything. I mean, this was the miracle, right? And I sold resveratrol, a lot of that. And I took it. I remember calling my dad and my parents, you got to take this stuff. And it was $100 a month and everything. And so after that, I realized that the basics are actually more effective. And all these new novel things that people get really excited about, I'm the most skeptical about those. And just getting back to the basics like magnesium, electrolytes, creatine, vitamin D, some probiotics in different conditions based upon someone's context.
I want to come back to the probiotics. I think microbiome, super interesting, also super complicated. But,
totally. We don't know enough about it. But there's context. Like if you're going to go on an antibiotic, it makes a lot of sense to take the probiotic yeast Saccharomyces boulardii. Tons of research on that showing that it will help prevent the antibiotic-associated disruption in your microbiome. Really good evidence, and it's really cheap. We're talking $10 a month.
I think that's the other piece that's tough in the supplement industry is some of the. I mean, you can spend hundreds, if not thousands, of dollars a month on these supplements, right?
Well, and not only that, but you could be exposing yourself inadvertently to arsenic, cadmium, lead, mercury. I mean, a lot of these things are grown in China or Europe and also India, and you don't know unless someone's doing good third-party testing.
Yeah, so how much of the challenge with the supplement industry do you think is a lack of regulation?
It's pretty regulated. So a lot of people are following FDA current good manufacturing processes. And so if a company is established and they're doing 10, 20 million, they're following pretty good pre and post product testing. Unfortunately, there's a lot of companies, very few manufacturers. So there's a lot of companies that are using the same manufacturers. Very few people are actually manufacturing their own stuff. But the ones that are generally the companies that you want to support.
So how can a typical person watching, or me, how can we know? Because, I mean, there's a lot of concern out there, like you said, about impurities and things like that in the supplements. What's sort of your rule of thumb for being confident that this is a company that is doing it as best they can? And I mean, I think some companies like Thorne have done a good job of marketing themselves as the company that's doing it right. I'm sure other companies are doing it right as well. But how can the typical person know whether it's just a marketing gimmick or they can really trust this supplement company?
It's a great question. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, fair.
And I think what you need to do is look at who owns the company. So you mentioned a company, Thorne. They were recently acquired by a private equity group. Not recently, I mean 10 years ago. So their founder, Al Zapp, and they started in Sandpoint, Idaho, and did a really great job. They manufactured their own stuff, and they started out really selling to naturopathic doctors. That's how Thorne got really big. But some of the things that, and I like what they do, but some of the things that they said made me a little bit question. They made a big stink about a common excipient flow agent called magnesium stearate. So just like when you make brownies, you need a little butter, right? So that things don't stick to the pan.
Yeah.
So you need stearic acid or palmitic acid in the supplement space so that when things are flowing through the encapsulation machines, you don't get powder sticking to the wall of the machine. So they made a really big stink about magnesium stearate, saying that, oh my gosh, this one study in mice found that if you supplement with 18% stearic acid in the diet, they get a reduction in natural killer cells. So they took that small study.
Scare people with something that's not relevant. Yeah.
So and instead they used lauric acid. So you're like, okay, and I did some research on stearic acid. It's the most abundant fatty acid in the entire plant and animal kingdom, as well as breast milk, olive oil, chocolate, sesame seeds, everything. Stearic acid is everywhere. But yet lauric acid, you're using that and you're saying that one is bad, one is good. So anyway, the point is, every company has their limitations and things like that. But I think it's good to know if the company has been recently acquired by a private equity group or Nestle or whoever else, because you might start to see changes in quality. But you want to look for, in general, brand.
But how are you going to know? Again, I'm not,
it's hard.
I get that you don't know you don't have the answer, but this is what I think of. It's like, how do I know who to trust?
One thing you want to look for is generally branded ingredients because they're going to be more expensive. So you might look for, say, Albion chelated minerals. So Albion is a company in Salt Lake City that provides most of the high quality minerals that supplement companies would use. So if you see that on the logo, on the bottle, you know that this company is paying a little bit more to have premium minerals that are, it's sourced here in the U.S.
Yeah.
They take amino acids and bind them as the chelating agent to, say, magnesium or potassium. So look for branded ingredients because they cost a little bit more. And that means that the company is trying to provide you the best quality raw materials and not shortchange you, because there's a lot of non-branded stuff in China that you can get for $1 a kilogram,
right.
That's really affordable. The branded stuff is going to cost significantly more. So, in general, that's what I would look for. I would also look for other things like, do they have cane sugar? Do they have coloring agents? How consistent is the brand in terms of providing things to you that are are conscious and aware? So that's the only thing I can say. And do they do third-party testing? You can just simply ask for that.
Right. And that's sort of where I land. I think right now, that's at least a specific metric that you can use to assess whether they're at least doing the sort of minimum that they should be doing to verify quality. Now, they can say they're doing third-party testing. Are they really doing third-party testing? I mean, again, you can go down this rabbit hole of how, I have trust issues when it comes to the supplement industry, but it's hard, right? So, but I mean, I think you said, stick with the basics, and you listed a few things: vitamin D, creatine, magnesium. What do you put on that list? Or what do you do, I guess, would be the quite obvious question.
It really depends on someone's age and things like that. So I just think, okay, if we're not eating a really good omnivorous whole food style diet,
which we should be.
We should be. I mean, so we're covering the basics there. But if we're not, we're traveling, work's busy, we might be having packaged food or going out to dinner or things like that. Then we want to cover the basics. I think vitamin D, vitamin A, vitamin K. So the fat soluble vitamins, we should be getting that. So if we're not having fermented foods, if we're not having fatty fish, we're not getting the sunlight, at least we're covering the basics with those. And we're talking $19 a month, maybe. So really affordable for the whole family. Going down the list, if we exercise, and we're sweating, going in the sauna, doing hot yoga, we're leaching out magnesium and zinc in our sweat. And we probably could benefit from just staying a little bit more hydrated. This research is a little bogus, but, maybe the Wi-Fi could dehydrate us a little bit in modern life. So I think hydration does help for a lot of people, especially around exercise. So that's really affordable. Plus you're getting magnesium, potassium, and good sodium. So I think those...
and do you think it's better to get those as dedicated supplements or in a multi?
So the multis are kind of like a C student in life. Yeah. They are not really good at any one thing. So I don't recommend a multi, to be honest. I don't. I think if people have polymorphisms in B vitamin metabolism, such as MTHFR or whatever, they should supplement with a B vitamin.
So what's the downside to a multi?
It's just a shotgun approach.
Yeah.
And most multis are, honestly, when the companies make them, I've been in these meetings before, they're just looking at what other companies are doing and say, hey, they only have 5 milligrams of zinc, we're going to do 7.5. So it's more like they're comparing each other to each other, and it's not really like, well, what do people need? Right. So I think that's sort of the challenge with the multi. And you're not getting enough of any one thing to really make a difference. Now, they're convenient, and I think the most red flaggy of supplements are the multi with the green drinks and the probiotics and the collagen all in one.
Yeah.
You're like, I don't know about all that.
No, I mean, personally, I've gone back and forth on a multivitamin, and actually just recently started taking a multi again. But to me, I agree completely with what you said. To me, it's more just like an insurance policy, right?
Totally.
Again, probably not any real downside, and if there are any deficiencies, maybe it'll take care of it. But on top of that, vitamin D, magnesium, B12, right?
Yeah.
Try to hit the fundamentals.
100%. And speaking of the multi, so one way you can vet a good company from a not so good company is looking at their forms of folate and B12 in a multi. Our not so high quality company will just have folic acid, which is the synthetic form of the bioactive form in the body is 5-methyl tetrahydrofolate. Mm-hmm. So you want to look for 5-MTHF. It'll all be capitalized. And then the form of B12 would be methylcobalamin. So if they're using cyanocobalamin and folic acid, probably not a high quality company, because the difference between folic acid and 5-MTHF is $1,000 per kilogram. And so the companies that are just they're not privately owned. They're owned by these venture capitalists and so forth. They're looking for the most margin they can get. So they're just going to put in folic acid. The same is true for cyanocobalamin versus methylcobalamin or adenosylcobalamin, orders of magnitude in difference in raw material cost. So that's how you can vet one company. But the multi would give you the good B vitamins, right? For example, hopefully enough magnesium and zinc to counterbalance, potential deficiencies. Maybe a little iron for menstruating women. I think for pregnant women, a multi makes a ton of sense. Yeah. Or breastfeeding, absolutely. Maybe children as well, because kids are picky. They want processed foods and stuff like that. So I think a multi in that context makes sense as well.
Right. Great. And I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned the green drinks, and we don't have to call any brand names out. But I kind of agree with you. I think some of these things, it's really much more about the marketing than it is about any evidence that they're useful at all.
Right.
And I think as we're learning, in some cases, these companies are much more about, revenue and profit than they are about making a high quality product.
Yeah.
So I think, I don't want to speak for you, but I think the way I would frame it is if you're paying a lot for a green drink, probably not the best way you could be investing your money in your health.
Totally. I mean, I look at the raw materials on that and the ingredients in the order of weight, and it's mostly wheatgrass and barley grass. And then they sprinkle. And look, you and I could make a green drink tomorrow. I mean,
Sure.
I know the people
Right.
to call.
Right.
And you look at this stuff, and it's just these prepackaged blends of different greens, And so that is kind of concerning to me because you're concentrating a lot of things that are probably sprayed with pesticides and herbicides. And so that's why a lot of those, some of them, you can't sell them in California because of Prop 65. Wow. So the naturally occurring things. So that's why if you're going to supplement anyway and all the green drinks, I don't generally recommend that, especially if you're going to have a pregnant woman wouldn't want to consume that, just because the inadvertent exposure to things, naturally, a lot of these things do have lead in them, right? And so you got to look out for that. And that is true for the vegan protein powders too. We ran into issues on the manufacturing side and sale in California because pea protein has lead. You're hyper concentrating. It's not that it's really high in lead naturally, but when you're condensing down in a protein concentrate, the amount of lead per serving could be a problem.
Do you ever measure heavy metals in your blood? Have you done that?
I have once, when I was doing a lot of competitive cycling. I was on the cycling team at Western and wanted to be a pro cyclist. I moved to Boulder, Colorado, where I got into this line of work. And I started to feel really off. And we would train around rush hour. And I found that I had a lot of cadmium and arsenic. Mm-hmm. And this was a urine exposure. So you take DMPS to kind of move things around, or DMPS or DMSA, I believe, to kind of stir the pot a little bit, and then you do a 24-hour urine collection and then send a sample of that to a lab. And my cadmium and lead and arsenic were quite high.
Yeah. I mean, I ask because, it's certainly not something that most people are going to get from a primary care blood test, but that's, again, one of the things that we look at in our comprehensive blood testing here at Optispan are a panel of heavy metals, right?
Sure.
And again, most people don't have any problem, but there are a subset of people who are pretty high, especially mercury. You see a lot if people are eating a lot of sushi. And I mean, it's generally good advice to eat more fish. But if you're, high in mercury, you want to be very thoughtful about the kind of fish you're eating. And so, it costs money. All of this stuff costs money. But I do think with some level of frequency, I don't know what the right frequency is, it's probably in your best interest to at least know where you're at. Maybe once a decade is enough. Like, I don't know, again, but if you are reaching, potentially toxic levels of some of these heavy metals, the only way you're probably going to know is either you start having symptoms, which is bad, or you measure it and you find out, and you then can take steps to try to figure out where it's coming from and then ameliorate it.
Yeah. It's a really important point, I think under-recognized. Absolutely.
I think this idea of environmental exposures is something that we're all starting to be more aware of. And this is another thing I struggle with is it's really easy to scare yourself, right? If you really start thinking about like the microplastic, we can talk about microplastics, right? I mean, Jesus Christ, it seems like everything in our environment is trying to kill us sometimes. Right. And so you want to be careful not to overstress yourself in thinking about these things, but you also want to try to be aware of what are the environmental exposures that are under my control that actually may be having a significant impact on my health. And metals are one. What are some of the other ways that you think about this? Microplastics, I think, is probably something you've thought about a lot, but what are some of the major environmental factors that you think about when you're thinking about health and that a lot of people maybe aren't as aware of as they could or should be?
Yeah, great question. The microplastics, because as of late, we have the study from New England Journal of Medicine where individuals undergoing a carotid artery assessment, they pulled plaque. I'm sure you read that study in March of this year, finding significant correlations. There was a 4.5-fold increased odds ratio of having a cerebral vascular or a stroke or some complication in the brain, and that correlated with higher levels of microplastic in the carotid artery plaque. So that was a huge study. One just came out, I think, on the 14th of August, finding, and these were individuals in China who presented at the hospital with acute coronary syndrome, so symptoms of a heart attack, and they wanted to look at microplastic exposure in their blood, and they used mass spec to look at 5 or 6 of the common polyethylene and all these different microplastics, and they had a control group that was not experiencing chest significant correlations with severity of the acute coronary syndrome and or heart attack or stroke like symptoms and microplastic levels in the blood. There was another recent study, I think it was June of this year, that found that individuals going in to get a penile prosthesis for severe erectile dysfunction. Well, since they were doing the prosthesis, this was a small study, it was 8 or 12 subjects. They were in there anyway. They sampled some of the penile tissue. The severity of erectile dysfunction correlated with the degree of microplastic contamination in the penile tissue. So to me, this is a huge factor. If we're looking at incidence of heart disease, the microplastics found in the atherosclerotic plaque, at least in the carotid arteries, I think this is a huge thing that we should be focusing on, because just something benign, like every day I go to Starbucks, I get my coffee on the way to work, that can release like 200,000 pieces of microplastic. This was Cedars-Sinai looked at the amount of microplastics from disposable coffee cups. It's quite significant. So just making these small shifts, like I saw you this morning with a ceramic mug, bringing that. I have one with me, not drinking out of plastic bottles.
Right. I was going to say, sometimes it's obvious, right? The plastic bottles, everybody gets it. You wouldn't necessarily think a
coffee cup
that you're going to get at the coffee shop is going to have microplastics in it, right?
Right, but if you look at the coffee cup, they have a thin polyethylene lining there to prevent it from penetrating. Yeah. And same even at Whole Foods, and the former CEO of Whole Foods, before Amazon acquired them, knew about this. Those little brown, they look organic and recyclable, compostable, but in even that packaging, there's a polyethylene lining.
About the boxes.
The box for it to go.
Yeah, I've eaten out of those several times.
Me too, multiple. So that's the thing, we're all exposed to this.
Yeah.
And
I mean, I think that's important, because I think you're right, people need to be aware of this, but you don't have to freak out about it. Again, it's this sort of, cumulative exposure over years or decades that probably starts to lead to increased risk for some of these things. And so, yes, we've all been exposed, some of us more than others. But the important point is to recognize if you are being exposed on a routine basis in your daily life, what steps can you take to reduce those exposures?
Exactly. And something else, just like a potato chip bag, that the lining of that,
Which you probably shouldn't be eating anyways.
Exactly. Yeah. So once I became aware of this, I'm like, processed food in general, I'm done with it.
Yeah.
Even if it's
I wish
gluten-free.
more people would get that. I mean, I agree. It took me decades longer than it probably should have to get there. But if more people would recognize that, that would be a huge boost to public health.
Yeah. So there's that. And then filtering the water. Municipal water, not only does it have fluoride and chlorine and things like that, but depending upon where you live, parts of the Midwest are actually the worst. So I used to work in Chicago, and I remember looking at this report that came out that found a lot of arsenic from the farming. There's a lot of corn and soy and stuff grown in the Midwest, ends up in the water supply, as well as atrazine. And atrazine can cause transgenerational epigenetic issues and all these problems, and you've probably seen the pictures of frogs that are gender dysphoric and stuff. Atrazine, among other things, can cause some of that. So I think your water needs to be filtered, as the best as you can. If it's a Brita, if that's all you can afford, fine. That's better than nothing. Not drinking out of plastic and trying to minimize, part of, I think, processed food, the health effects or ramifications from consuming processed food is linked to the packaging itself.
Yeah. I agree. I think the only thing I would maybe add to that is, again, to sort of reinforce that it takes a lot of exposure probably to lead to significant problems. So like if you're on a hike or you're somewhere where the only access you have is to bottled water, like don't freak out. Having bottled water once in a while is not going to significantly increase your risk for heart disease or dementia or whatever. But to the extent you can create new habits where you avoid as much of this stuff as possible, you should probably try to do that.
Excellent point.
Yeah. Okay. So that's great. I guess the other thought I have about microplastics, and I'm not a microplastic denier at all, but I do, given my scientific background, I do sort of wonder if I think it's going to be a while before we actually know what the real risk profile looks like, because I do wonder, of these high profile studies that get a lot of attention, how many studies tried to do the same thing and didn't see a correlation. Like, you just don't know because there's a publication bias. The other question I've got, maybe you know the answer to this, I haven't researched it yet, is are there yet clinical tests that we can use to actually measure the microplastic levels in our bodies at either way, whether it's urine or blood? Do those exist? Are they available?
Not to my knowledge. I'm sure there is one out there, but I haven't personally done this.
It would be really useful, obviously, to have that. Yeah.
That'd be amazing. I'm sure someone's working on it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So TBD, but that's probably something that we should also start measuring when we have the capacity. Okay, cool. So one thing that I actually wasn't planning to talk about, but I was in my car. I've got a reasonably long commute coming into work, and I'm thinking, okay, what do I want to listen to today? And I thought I should probably listen to one of Mike's recent podcasts because I'm going to talk to him today. And so the first one I think I came on YouTube was you just got a epigenetic age test done. And so you put out it was a pretty short video on that. But let's talk about your experience there. So this was, I think, the True Diagnostic Epigenetic Age Test. I know we talked about this when I was at your place recently. So what was your experience and your take home from that? And I'm gonna push you a little bit on this.
No, yeah, I would like to. You know what? I think I'm a little biased because I had conversed with you prior to making that video, right?
Yeah.
I don't put too much weight into that. I think these are fleeting, I don't know. I don't know the specificity and how much does maybe 1 week of lifestyle change prior to testing affect things. So
I think that's actually a really interesting question, is how short-term responsive are these tests? Yeah. We don't know the answer to that. Yeah.
I don't. I mean, I was mostly interested in the Dunedin Pace of Aging, the Dunedin POAM score. There were other so-called multi-omic scores, and somehow they looked at my hormone age score. All these things. And to me, I was like, well, how are they coming up with this information?
It's not very transparent. I agree. So I'll tell you my understanding. And again, I could be a little bit off base, but I think I have a reasonable understanding of how they're doing this, right? So all of this is based off of the methylation marks that's being collected from your blood cells when you do the finger prick blood spot card. And they identify a subset of these methylation marks that are correlated with different parameters, right? So the first way these things were developed were chronological age, as we talked about. But I think for like the hormone age, or I think you had a VO2 max assessment as well, which will be interesting. I think all they do is they have different subset of these methylation marks that have been shown in at least one study to be correlated with this VO2 max parameter, right? So it's a correlative relationship. And I think that's the question, is how strong are those correlations, and how predictive are they outside of the sometimes one study where it's been tested?
Yeah, so I question that a little bit because I know my VO2 max is significantly higher than what they reported there.
Right.
They also looked at telomeres, and I've heard that that's pretty controversial because you want to be looking at, to the best of my knowledge, the super critically short telomeres. I don't know.
Again, it's an area where I don't think that we know with 100% certainty. But you're right. There's two issues with telomeres. The techniques for measuring them aren't fantastic, and we've got 46 telomeres or so in every cell in our body, and they all vary. So it's not a single number, it's a distribution of numbers. And like you said, I think some people, it's reasonable, believe that it's the shortest telomeres that are really causing the DNA damage response that then causes aspects of aging. So yeah, whether these correlations are predicting telomere length, average, or critically short telomere with any accuracy, also a bit unclear. But again, for me, I think the challenge is it's a correlation of epigenetic marks to something else. And if there's imprecision in the measurement of that something else, like with the telomeres, it's a correlation to an imprecise measurement that's actually trying to measure something else. And so once you start to propagate errors, it's like all bets are off.
It becomes just a random.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit better than random, we would hope. But anyways, I mean, I thought the episode was interesting because, like you said, your VO2 max was different than what you had measured it at previously. Your telomere length, I don't think you'd ever had measured previously, so you don't even know what that means. Yeah, your Dunedin pace was pretty good. I think you said it was like 0.7 something.
Yeah.
So that's the idea that you can measure this pace of aging, right? And that seemed to be the one. So what I took from your video, that's the one that you kind of felt the most confident about.
Yeah, I mean, I think just because I've been following some of that research for a while, and I feel like out of all the different algorithms and sort of ways to triangulate how well you're aging, to me that seems like it has some of the best data. I could be wrong. So that was what I was most interested on. And if you look, and I don't necessarily agree with everything Brian Johnson says, but he has this rejuvenationolympics.com or something, and that's the proxy that they're all using to so-called get on the board. So that was what I was kind of interested in about.
Yeah. I mean, I think that metric is pretty compelling, right? Okay. The original metric, which I think was more based on, functional measures that were correlated with health outcomes. And then again, what True Diagnostics has done was to take a epigenetic pattern that correlates with the functional metrics that are associated with health outcomes. And so, yeah, I mean, again, I don't have a strong feeling about the epigenetic, the accuracy of that particular epigenetic test. I do tend to agree with you that of all of them, I think that's the one that's potentially the most interesting. If it really is reflecting something about the rate of biological aging, that's interesting. And I think it probably is telling you something about health. I think that's the other place where I am uncertain is health status the same as biological age?
Right.
And I mean, I think they're certainly related, but are they equivalent? I don't know. And I think this is where the definition of biological age just gets murky. Yeah. In my view.
No, I agree. I mean, to your point, it seems like the facial imaging using AI.
Yeah, that was the other thing I wanted to talk to you about, because I don't know if I didn't communicate it well, but I think you had said that I felt the facial age was the best of the biological age tests. I don't think that.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
No. So I think probably what I meant to say was that you can use facial images to create algorithms that are roughly as good as the epigenetic algorithms at predicting chronological age or predicting health status. And so are they better than epigenetic age? Like, I don't know. But I think the issue with the facial age stuff is there's just so many things that you can do cosmetically to
put on makeup beforehand. Yeah.
To kind of screw the algorithm up. And people do that, obviously. And also the thing I wonder about with the facial age is, we know that sun exposure can obviously make you look older. Is that really reflecting the age of the rest of your body? Probably probably not. So,
Right. Good
so
point.
I think none of these tests are optimal at this point, which is why I sort of half jokingly but half seriously say they're for entertainment value only,
Yeah.
right?
No, it makes sense. I think a lot of people put too much, along those lines, put too much weight in any given one test at all.
I agree.
They
Yeah.
get their blood work at a doctor's office and say, see, I do not have diabetes because they had one, fasting glucose level that was below 80 milligrams per deciliter. It's like, well, that was one snapshot in time.
Right.
So I think it is good, this over time and this serial, cumulative testing, I think it's good. So that's what I've been doing, just my own lab since 2006.
Have you done any other biological age testing or just the epigenetic test?
That one MyDNH that came out of San Diego or something, I think Steve Horvath was part of that.
Yep.
I did that one.
Also epigenetic though, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I haven't done any other multi-omics or proteomics or things like that.
The other thing that I thought you touched on in your video that's interesting is this new Symphony report that True Diagnostic has, which is this organ age test, right? I think it came out of Morgan Levine's lab at Yale originally. That is an interesting test. Again, I don't think we know enough yet about how predictive it is, but in principle, it can tell you something about the health status of your individual organs. And for some people, the kidney may be the limiting factor, and other people it may be the brain. So I don't remember what your results were, if anything jumped out there, but it's an interesting new thing they're offering.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. That one said my hormones were off. And that kind of makes it, I did steroids in college twice, so that could be a thing. But everything else I believe was on point.
Have you gotten a comprehensive hormone test?
Not recently.
Okay.
I really go off symptoms on that.
Yeah.
So I supplement with DHEA. I'm not on HRT or anything like that. But if there was a weak point, maybe that would be. But I don't have any symptoms with libido or morning wood or things like that. Yeah. But I have noticed, I just turned 42 last weekend, actually. I have noticed this year I feel like muscle mass is not I don't have as much muscle mass and slightly less strength compared to years past. I think I'm starting to see maybe a pivot, and it could be a little bit placebo oriented because Stanford came out with that study where there was two little inflection points.
Yes, right.
44 and 60.
We go through this accelerated aging process at two specific points in our lives. Yeah,
right.
I haven't actually done a deep dive on that paper yet, so I shouldn't comment.
Okay.
But there's other data out there supporting this idea that there are periods of life where we go through different aging trajectories. So I think there's real interesting biology there. I think the way it got presented in the media was probably, like often is the case, not an accurate representation of the data.
Yeah, I dove into it. It looked like mostly carbohydrate metabolism, caffeine, and alcohol metabolism significantly change around 44. And then again, lipid metabolism more so at 60. So it kind of makes sense. I found that, and I don't drink anymore, but, around 40, I don't handle alcohol like I used to.
Yeah.
So why even bother with it? And I feel like a lot of people feel that way about caffeine too. Most adults I know.
I haven't gotten there with caffeine yet.
You still just crush it.
Yeah, I drink a lot of coffee
Nice.
and I enjoy it a lot. So,
Oh, it's great. Yeah, I love coffee as well. But going back to the other testing, the other one I've been curious about is the glyco age.
Yeah, glycan age.
Glycan age, yeah. So that was out of the UK, I think they're.
Yeah, so that is based on work from Gordon Lauch's lab, where they have shown that these patterns of glycan on blood proteins can be associated with a bunch of different health conditions, including originally chronological age and then more recently mortality and disease risk. And so it's a very different test. So we actually here at Optispan, we use True Diagnostic, epigenetic age, glycan age, and then an immune senescence test, which we've talked about on the podcast before, called SAPIR-X, not as a diagnostic, none of them as diagnostic tools, but more to try to figure out what are they each telling us, and how well do they compare to each other? And I think the glycan age test is very different from the epigenetic test. In my, again, I haven't done a formal analysis yet, but in my experience, there's not a lot of correlation there. And I think other people have seen that as well. I think they're just measuring different aspects of biological age. And that's partly why I don't think any of them in and of themselves are, sort of complete measures of biological age.
Sure.
But the organ age one, again, coming back to that, I think is very interesting. The thing that I'm not so sure about there is I don't think that study has been peer reviewed yet. It's based off of a preprint and yet already being marketed in a direct to consumer format, which is, again, it's kind of like the supplement industry. This is where I struggle a bit with the whole biological age direct-to-consumer tests, because I feel like they're rushed to market, rushed to consumers, not always explained in a very clear way. And there's the potential there, especially when amplified by people like Brian Johnson, to mislead a lot of people.
Yeah.
And so it's concerning to me that there isn't much regulation, and these things are being marketed in ways that are not always transparent and in some cases dishonest. And then what really concerns me are when the epigenetic age tests are paired with the supplements.
This is, oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, I have a story on that. There was a company called Neuroscience, and they would do that with urinary neurotransmitters. So if you had low dopamine in your urine, well, they had a dopamine enhancing supplement and all this. And that, I think they actually got shut down by, like, I don't know if it's the FTC or FBI. There was a lot of things. So anyway, when the lab company also conveniently sells the supplements, that is a little red flag.
You see that a lot in the biological age testing. In fact, I don't think True Diagnostics is selling supplements, but most of the other biological age test companies, I don't think Glycan Age is either, but most of them are. And so, yeah, you just have to be very, buyer beware, I think is the right message there. But yeah, it's a little sketchy.
Totally. So, yeah, I think any of these tools, take it with a grain of salt, but I think it is a nice piece of the puzzle, and it's interesting for people to see. I mean, for example, if the Dunedin Poem thing came back at 1.2, I'd be like, wow, I got to change some things around.
I think if it motivates you to make positive changes in your lifestyle, and over time you can then see a change in that metric, that's great, right? That's a win-win. I think we still don't quite know exactly how sensitive these tests are, but yeah, I think they can be motivational tools, and in that context can be positive. Yeah. Okay, cool. So, so one of the topics I wanted to talk to you about is around going back to like lipid biology and cholesterol and ApoB, and so. I mean, you've been in this business a long time, so you kind of have to develop a thick skin when people are going to comment on whatever you talk about. But when we posted a short for our visit to you, a couple of the people commented about your views on cholesterol and ApoB. And so I'm just wondering, maybe you can just say from your mouth, what are your thoughts on this topic?
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I feel that I've made my thoughts pretty clear. I think we have more questions than answers at this point. Those are my thoughts on this, because the reigning dogma for the past 60 years is butter, saturated fat, red meat raises LDL cholesterol. Cholesterol is linked with increased risk of having a stroke or a heart attack. And so therefore, you need to reduce your intake of butter, saturated fat, and red meat. And we've seen over numerous epidemiological studies or even controlled feeding studies where individuals do just that. This was the Minnesota coronary experiment as well as the Sydney heart study. Took individuals with high cholesterol, randomized them to either have increased PUFAs from corn. Back then, these were the types of oils. It's usually either they'll reduce butter or saturated fat and replace that with corn or soy oil to increase the amount of unsaturated polyunsaturated fat in the diet. And in these two studies, and these were really before. And why do I mention these? Because this was before the bias in both the medical researchers as well as the doctors was really part of the zeitgeist. Because after 1960s and the Ansel Keys 7-country study and the diet heart hypothesis and the McGovern report and all these things, everyone had the perception that saturated fat is bad, right? So this was pre-indoctrination, if you will. You didn't see the shifts in mortality that you would expect. Actually, the groups that ate more corn and soy oil and reduced their intake of butter and red meat and so forth. And these were long-term feeding studies, like not in a metabolic ward, but just advising people year-long, the Minnesota coronary experiment. There was increased mortality in the group that actually had more polyunsaturated fat in the diet. And yet their LDL cholesterol levels were lower. So I think we have more questions than answers. It's a little bit more of a nuanced perspective in conversation. So that has been my stance, particularly, and I'll just back up. Most people believe, and the reigning dogma within the medical community is this hypothesis known as the continual exposure hypothesis.
Yeah.
So the more that you're exposed to high LDL cholesterol, you're progressively increasing over time, just like we talked about microplastics, increasing the probability that you will develop atherosclerotic plaque and therefore increase your odds of having a major adverse cardiovascular event, either a stroke or heart attack, right? So that's the hypothesis. I think there's a more nuanced conversation that we know that 80% of the atherogenic lipoproteins, we're talking VLDL, remnant lipoprotein, LDL, they go in and out of the vascular endothelium. That just naturally happens. So part of how the atherosclerotic plaque process works on the sort of cellular level is the thinking is that the plaque gets into the vascular endothelium and it needs to get in there to deliver fat-soluble nutrients because our blood, of course, is water-based. So we need we talked about vitamin D, we talked about vitamin K, coenzyme Q10. These are delivered in these lipoproteins that your liver actually makes. And they go into the vessel wall and they leave and they don't cause plaque. They deliver their payload, they deliver their fatty acids, cholesterol. Every cell needs cholesterol, as you very well know. But why in some people do they get stuck in there and initiate the process of atherosclerosis? And I think that's the more interesting question is what conditions and what unique variables, and I believe, and evidence links this, if they're prone to having increased free radical or oxidative stress. Because we need the macrophage, a type of white blood cell, part of our innate immune system, to engulf this modified LDL lipoprotein to then initiate the fatty streak in the foam cell formation that culminates in plaque that leads to events. So I think the more interesting question is what subset or clinical conditions lead to increased formation of plaque formation from this exposure to LDL? Because we need LDL. Like you can't just drive it to the bottom. And here's what's interesting, Matt, over the last 5 years is we've had numerous studies find that there is a so-called cholesterol paradox, and it's seemingly unexplainable by conventional scientists that there is a subset in these cohort studies and so forth, people who have high LDL and they have lower incidence of major adverse cardiovascular events. And these investigators say this is a paradox. Sure. If the hypothesis that LDL cholesterol level, continual exposure to that is driving heart disease and increased rates of death from heart disease, then how do we have the subset of the population that has higher LDL than the guidelines suggest, yet has lower prevalence of events? And I think the way that people tend to rationalize this, if they are in the high cholesterol is bad camp, is they will say, well, the people that have low LDL, by the time they have an event, they're already so sick anyway, that the low LDL is a consequence of their underlying pathology.
Yeah.
So I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
And that makes a lot of sense. Again, I think we have more questions than answers. If that is true, then we should be investigating that further.
So I mean, it sounds like your position is that the dogma that it's all about LDL and cumulative exposure is too simplistic to explain the data. Not that there's no relationship between LDL and heart disease,
right?
But we need to better understand the mechanistic underpinnings. And I guess a follow-on question would be, though, what are your thoughts on the sort of current standard of care, which largely comes down to trying to reduce LDL in many cases, right? And do you feel like that there are places where that should be modified?
It's an excellent question. I think this is a highly individual and personalized decision based upon one's metabolic health. And so, for example, and this goes back to this so-called lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, where an individual generally, if they go on a low-carb, high-fat, ketogenic style diet or carnivore diet, there's a subset, maybe 25% of the population, who will invariably have their LDL cholesterol goes through the roof. Their HDL also increases, but their triglycerides go down. And so if individuals in that express that phenotype,
according to conventional standards, would be at much higher risk of having cardiovascular disease.
Right.
But when many of these people, and unfortunately, this is happening in real time. I mean, people have been doing keto like this or carnivore. We're talking maybe 2-3 years.
Right. I was going to say, we don't have the long-term data on enough people yet to really know what the outcomes are.
I mean, this is so new. So I think we really need a citizen science project where people would self-submit in a controlled way their data and see, and just in real time. I mean, these epidemiological studies take way too long for us to figure out what's really going on, and they're inherently inaccurate.
And the environment is changing at a faster and faster rate. And so what might have been the case 20 years ago could be a little bit different now because of all this stuff in our environment that's different, right? So I think the biological complexity here, and this is something that we keep coming back to on the podcast a lot, is that we have to create these simple models because that's the best we can do right now, but recognize it's in the framework of a complexity of biology that is not represented by those models. And as scientists, we should really be trying to figure out where the model's incomplete, and can we break the models and come up with better models?
No, I wholeheartedly agree. But going back to what do people do if their LDL cholesterol is high and they're with their mainstream medical doctor? I think it's a very nuanced perspective. And so we need to also look at the other associated biomarkers. And so I think invariably, metabolic disease, having prediabetes, diabetes, is going to create the hormonal and physiologic milieu that will make LDL more likely to become modified.
And it's going to be more inflammatory, right?
Exactly. So I think if you have high LDL, but your metabolic health based upon your hemoglobin A1C, your blood triglycerides, your fasting glucose, you can look at fasting or non-fasted insulin. I think non-fasted labs are arguably the best way to ascertain cardiovascular risk. That's
interesting.
My perspective for a long time. And there was a consensus statement paper back in 2008. I remember reading it at the coffee shop called Inc. in Colorado, that we should be looking at labs non-fasted, and particularly lipids non-fasted, because atherosclerosis happens not when we're fasted sleeping. It's really in the post-meal state. We start to see constriction of the coronary arteries. And if you look at the correlation coefficient with different biomarkers in terms of post-meal coronary artery constriction, blood glucose most significantly tethers more strongly than LDL cholesterol with coronary artery constriction and the endothelial dysfunction in the post-meal window. So I think that is really something that we should reconsider. So again, to clarify for the haters out there, my perspective is that LDL is certainly a factor. We can't argue that it's intimately linked with the process of atherosclerosis, but it's sort of like looking, in my opinion, at the ambulance, saying the ambulance is causing accidents when it's, the cholesterol could be, it's a repair molecule. We know that. So I think there is some initial insult, and this probably is from hypertension. Probably from oxidative stress, from prediabetes.
Right. And I mean, I think it's interesting how, what you're pointing to is these systems are interconnected, right? And the metabolic homeostasis is going to be tied into your immune function, which is going to probably influence the extent to which the different LDL particles are inflammatory and plaque inducing and causing pathology, right? It's all connected. And so I think that may be why you have these outlier cases where you can have people who, based on this one biomarker, should be developing heart disease, but seem to be perfectly healthy because maybe they're not metabolically perturbed, right?
Yeah, that's a great point. And then another study that I recently have been diving into using this was the AMORA score, which stands for the Apolipoprotein Mortality Risk Assessment, I believe is the acronym. And this is a group in Sweden that has been tracked for 40 years. And what this analysis looked at, and it was really interesting, I will send you the paper. They looked at individuals at the age of 60, and they wanted to track to see what sort of common biomarkers would be linked with reaching their 100th birthday, becoming a centenarian. And higher LDL cholesterol levels at age 60 were linked with greater odds of becoming a centenarian. In the same fashion, high glucose was inversely correlated with the odds of becoming a centenarian. Liver enzymes, which are a proxy of metabolic health, as you know, higher liver enzymes, lower odds of becoming a centenarian. So essentially, the poor metabolic health will reduce your likelihood of having a long, healthy life.
Yeah.
And if the continual LDL exposure is the model that really fully explains all of heart disease and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease and cardiovascular events, then why would someone at 65 having high LDL have a higher odds of becoming a centenarian compared to people who have lower LDL? And that's just one cohort. But to me, that's interesting. And so I think, again, we have more questions than answers.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you see this a lot with all sorts of different biomarkers and the population that you're looking at, right? I mean, again, we've talked a little bit, I think, about protein when I was on your podcast, but you see a same sort of, or some studies see a same sort of correlation with age, where the amount of protein in the diet is sort of inversely flipped in terms of its effect on mortality based on age, right? And most of these studies are done, if they're done in the United States, in a population of people that are eating a garbage diet and are mostly sedentary, right? And so the relationship between a single biomarker and disease outcome or death could be very different in a sedentary, overweight population eating a bunch of processed foods versus an active population that is eating a whole food diet, right? So I think that's where we do have to be very careful about the way the studies were done, especially when we don't have a clear mechanistic connection between the biomarker and the outcome that we're interested in.
Right. And speaking of the biomarker, using LDL cholesterol, a lot of people don't know this, but when you go to Quest or LabCorp, it's not even a direct measurement. This is using the Friedewald equation. This is an estimation. And so, that's the challenge here is we're using probably not the best tool to make sweeping medical claim or, changes with pharmaceutical interventions or what have you. And so it's just not the best tool, in my opinion. Now, I agree with many of the things that Dr. Peter Attia says. I mean, he's had Tom Dayspring and many people on the podcast. So when you hear a perspective that all ApoB-containing lipoproteins are causing atherogenesis and leading to plaque formation, so the lower the better, I understand that mindset as well. And so again, I think this is a very personal perspective based upon your metabolic health, whether or not your blood pressure is high. I think in people who have hypertension, LDL should be low. People who are eating a standard American diet, rich in polyunsaturated and linoleic acid containing vegetables.
Which again, nobody should be doing that.
They should have low LDL, because if your LDL is high and you're eating a lot of processed food, then it's more likely to be oxidized.
Yeah,
we have really good evidence to show that.
Right.
So again, I think this is a much more nuanced thing. But as you know, the internet, you have this binary, you're either on our team or against our team, and people.
And I think there is, I don't know if need's the right word. There is a feeling that we do need these population level guidelines that can match a majority of the population, right? But I think they're often not recognized as these are global guidelines that may or may not apply in your individual situation. And so that's where, again, this goes back, there's all sorts of challenges with the healthcare system and primary care and all of that. But because of the system we've got, you almost have to have these very simple one-size-fits-all guidelines that are going to work for a majority of people. But I think what you're suggesting, and I would agree, is those guidelines don't apply to everybody. And if we don't understand when they don't apply, that can lead to a lot of problems for those people that they don't apply to.
I wholeheartedly agree. And I think a better reflection of metabolic health would be the triglyceride to HDL ratio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we should care more, in my opinion, about triglycerides and HDL than just looking at LDL. Because again, LDL is a Friedewald equation. It's an estimation. Triglycerides really don't lie when it comes to metabolic health. If someone is sedentary and eats junk food, their triglycerides, well, you can see on their blood work. You could almost you can guess their body composition and pretty accurately just looking at triglycerides, HDL, and liver enzymes. I can see just looking at labs. I mean, I've had so many doctors over the years in my line of work looking at labs, and I do my own clinical practice that I've worked with people since 2006. You can just see metabolic health with triglycerides, liver enzymes, and HDL. If someone is physically fit or exercises, their triglycerides and HDL will be high. HDL will be high, triglycerides will be around 50 or lower. I mean, you can see an athlete based upon those two biomarkers. And I think we should have a little bit more emphasis on that than just LDL. So that's my perspective. And what's unique about the triglycerides is they invariably decrease when someone makes healthful changes. Mm-hmm. Oftentimes the LDL doesn't really change. It can even go up when they get healthier. Right. And that to me is paradoxical. So that's just the whole perspective. Even if you look at non-fasted LDL, I've worked with athletes who are very fit, lean body mass, body fat percentage in 8%. When they do fasted exercise, LDL will go up to like 400.
Wow.
So you're like, well, that's wild to me. So it means that LDL is doing a lot more than just so-called causing atherogenesis. It's involved in energy transport throughout the body.
Yeah.
So
yeah, cool. Well, thank you. I mean, I think it's like you said, there are, I think, people with strongly held opinions, obviously, and oftentimes, unfortunately, we get put into camps that I mean, this happens to both of us, where we don't really see ourselves in those camps. We just kind of get put there because people believe that's what we think. So thank you for expanding a little bit and giving some nuance and context, because I think it's clearly an important topic and discussion. So we talked a little bit about some of the biomarkers that you think are particularly useful. I mean, again, are there so you talked about the triglycerides to HDL, non-fasted markers of insulin and lipids. Are there anything else that you think are like, what are the core biomarkers that people who really are interested in their health should be paying attention to?
Yeah, great question. I mean, just the common ones, kind of like we talked about nutrition or supplements, things like that, covering the basics. I think just getting, CBC, Chem24, looking at, and the liver enzymes, I think are particularly insightful from looking at not only metabolic health, but also particularly, so you have 3 liver function tests, ALT, AST, GGT. For whatever reason, GGT is often omitted when I see individuals that just go to Kaiser or whatever, because most doctors have been trained that we run GGT if someone is an alcoholic, because that enzyme will increase.
Got it.
But actually, there's a Dr. Lee in South Korea we talked about, is there any good test for looking at persistent organic pollutants or plastics? GGT is a really good marker of persistent organic pollutant exposure, the so-called POPs or endocrine disrupting chemicals. She's found this to correlate with heavy metals, with BPA, with phthalates, because it turns out that GGT increases when our body's making glutathione. It's the acronym for GGT is gamma glutamyl transpeptidase. So it's involved in the intracellular transport of the rate-limiting amino acids that make glutathione, particularly this one is cysteine. And so it's involved in that. And so when it's increased, it's thought to correlate with either increased glutathione demand from exposure to junk, or and that junk could be alcohol and so forth, and increased heavy metal. So I like to see the liver enzymes under 30. This is units per liter. As individuals become more metabolically unhealthy, as you know, fat tends to accumulate in the liver, and the liver starts spilling out these enzymes. So we start to see ALT and GGT start to increase. I've seen them as high as 300. I mean, this is crazy. People with fatty liver disease from uncontrolled diabetes. I mean, it's wild.
Yeah, and I mean, the estimates keep going up, but it's something like a third or more of people in the United States have fatty liver now, and most of that's diet. So I think that's a huge issue. But if you see elevated liver enzymes, what's the take-home message? I mean, obviously, if it's pathologically elevated, it's going to be a different sort of situation. But for somebody who's sort of, in your view, borderline elevated, like what would you be like, okay, here's what you need to focus on?
Yeah, well, I would address a few different things. Is this an occupational exposure to toxins or lifestyle exposure or heavy metals? Do they have mercury amalgams? Do they smoke cigarettes? Once you roll all that stuff out, it's like, well, I live a really clean life. Well, I would address metabolic health and say, okay, we need to do walking after meals, 10 to 15 minute walks, exercise snacks, resistance training, probably do a lower carb diet. Again, everyone's a little bit different about how they respond.
And hopefully you would have some other biomarkers that can sort of inform as well about metabolic health at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah. And that being said, I've had a few people I've worked with over the years where their ALT is just randomly high. There's like, hey, it's always been 50.
Yeah,
I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
I've done all these things. And I think that's totally fine. I think there's a lot of individual variability here. And I would also say, just if one test is off, redo the test.
Yes.
I read
that does happen.
It's crazy. I remember when I first got into this in 2008, my ferritin was like 400.
Yeah.
And I thought I have hemochromatosis. Oh my gosh, I have to get the hemochromatosis gene tested. This. My mentor was like, just redo the test.
Yeah.
I redid it, and it was like 120.
Yeah, it's funny because anybody who's ever worked in a laboratory doing research, right? You immediately will appreciate sometimes you just get a spurious measurement. Maybe you did something wrong, maybe the equipment didn't work, whatever. But when we go to blood tests through LabCorp or Quest or whatever, there's this sort of like, we think that it's accurate, and it's no different. Like, there's imprecision in every measurement tool. Sometimes weird stuff happens. Sometimes mistakes are made. So yeah, I agree completely. And that's actually really a valuable thing for the average person to appreciate, is if you get a blood test done, one result comes back way out of whack, don't freak out. First thing is get it retested, and there's a pretty good chance, if it's only one thing that's out of whack, that it will come back normal the next time around.
Yeah, it's funny. People just get really bent out of shape about this. And so, just redo that. But going back to, so what do we do if our liver enzymes are high? There's good evidence to suggest that in this case, an acetylcysteine supplementation, that's another one we talked about. This is an amino acid precursor to the important intracellular antioxidant and detoxification molecule known as glutathione. And so Baylor University has done a lot of research pairing NAC with glycine.
Yeah. Glynac, yeah.
Yeah, Glynac comment. So that could be something that might help specifically in the context of ALT elevations and GGT elevations.
Is that something you think everybody should think about, or do you specifically think about it in the context of these biomarkers that are maybe a little off?
Good question. Around COVID during the cold and flu season, there was good evidence to suggest that NAC may help with that and lung health. If someone lives near a freeway, the PM 2.5, whatever the particulate matter data shows, if we're eating junk food, going out, traveling a lot. I mean, if someone's exposure to junk is high, I do think, and it's affordable. It's an amino acid that's $25 a month, something like that. I think the Glynac combo is good. Yeah. And it may help with sleep. There's the glycine is the amino acid precursor to make GABA. GABA is a calming neurotransmitter. So I think, there is translation in other areas. And since we talked about perivascular disease and LDL becoming oxidized, glutathione is your most important intracellular antioxidant.
Right.
So I do think over 60, it makes sense. It's not like, all these expensive longevity things are $100 a month.
Do you take it?
I do. Yeah, I have a conflict of interest. I actually formulated an NAC glycine combo. So that's my conflict. But not every day. I don't take it every day. Like if I had been traveling, I got back from Europe and was on 3 different airplanes and stuff. So I'll take in that, like 3 grams of each at night. But it's not an everyday thing.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So, but exercise can help too with liver health as well. So if liver enzymes are up, we want to see, is it persistent organic pollutant exposure, or is it just poor metabolic health and there's fat accumulation in the liver? Elevated triglycerides and increased proxies of poor glucose tolerance would give us the insight as to whether or not, again, it's heavy metal or persistent organic pollutant exposure or metabolic health. And so if one's triglycerides are high, glucose, hemoglobin A1C is high, and liver enzymes are high, then we just have to crank down that dial and be more stringent with exercise.
Yeah. So then that raises a question in my mind is kind of, where do you stand on this idea that diabetes can be reversed?
I've seen really impressive things with lifestyle change. And this is, again, working with doctors for almost 20 years in this space. Now, type 1 diabetes, probably not.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. But type 2, a lot of improvement.
And maybe it's useful for people just to appreciate, like, the definition of diabetes is, again, it's a measured definition, right? So is it really the case that when you reach a specific point for this one marker of hemoglobin glycation that you go from being non-diabetic to diabetic? No, right? But that's sort of a clinical definition. So I think that diabetes is one of those conditions where the diagnosis of having the disease is a bit arbitrary. And so maybe it's not surprising that it should be possible to reverse that diagnosis.
Totally. It's a spectrum.
Yeah.
And all these diseases exist on a spectrum. And I think that's a really important point that you just mentioned, because someone goes to the doctor and they clean up their diet for a couple of days and their doctor says, you have no diabetes, we'll see you next year. And just because their glucose will say 95.
And one fasting measurement, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have family members who have said that, and now they're on metformin or insulin.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, well, we tried to tell you a while ago that your triglycerides were high, you're trending there. But like, no, my doctor said I'm fine. So I think based upon where someone is on this path of developing diabetes, it's certainly reversible. I think, part of the etiology is insulin resistance in the skeletal muscle, as well as pancreatic beta cell damage. And so I think just with exercise, and even if someone doesn't completely reverse their diabetes and they require insulin, if they clean up their lifestyle, they're going to need much less insulin.
Right.
So that's,
absolutely,
I think, the most important thing, because we know insulin is involved in a lot of negative pathology in the body. And so the less insulin that you can exogenously need or depend upon, the better. So, and I've seen that often.
Yeah.
Even working with someone with Parkinson's, going on a keto diet, they really improve their symptoms.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Again, this points to how the systems are connected, but, all of this evidence that some people have been talking about for 15, 20 years that now is starting to become accepted with these neurodegenerative disorders, and how many of the same sort of lifestyle modifications that we've been talking about can have pretty profound effects on, sometimes reversing symptoms, but at a minimum, delaying the progression of symptoms. So all of these systems of health are tied together, and by and large, the same sort of strategies seem to be beneficial across the board for many different conditions.
Right. And so it just goes to show that some of these foundational processes like blood sugar homeostasis is critical for all of these different organ systems.
Right.
Detoxification or preventing exposure. Like, I know that that's a weird word for people, but minimizing your exposure to these plastics and heavy metals, circadian rhythm health. I mean, a great way to cause diabetes is just work the night shift. Your blood sugar tolerance will just go down, which is sad. It's for people who, there's doctors that work the night shift on the cancer ward or whatever. Right. It's really tough. So, but all these foundational processes are so important for all these different organ systems. So that's why these lifestyle interventions are actually really, really effective.
Yeah, great. So this is a good way to kind of segue into maybe this will be the last topic we talk about. So let's kind of come up to a higher level, right? So, I mean, here at Optispan, we kind of think about, at the sort of macro level, 4 pillars of health, right? So eat, nutrition, move, exercise, sleep, and connect, which is kind of a combination of both, mindfulness and human relationships, connectedness to the world around you, connectedness to other people. So for each of those, maybe we can just kind of talk about what's your strat? What do you do? And is there any place where you feel like, you've actually made a lot of progress, or you still need to make some progress? That's kind of, I think, a good exercise for everybody to go through and think about where's the weak link and where are some of the things that I can do to shore up these pillars of health.
Yeah, I love that question. When I was in my 20s and 30s, I think I would underemphasize the importance of connecting with other people and could be a lone wolf and just work, and go to the gym and I realized that loneliness and social isolation is really detrimental for not only your own mental wellness, but also your physiological health. So I definitely prioritize that and try to really schedule things. So on the weekends, a couple days a week, just really to make sure hey, I'm going to connect with this friend and not leave it to the last minute. Like, oh, we have no plans this weekend. What are we going to do? Like, try to really get out in front of that. And especially around, in this area, it's tough anyway, this whole so-called Seattle freeze, so you have to be really intentional about this.
Yeah.
And knowing that it makes you feel good. And it's also linked with longevity, lifespan. I think, what's the researcher in UCLA who has looked at the research of social isolation and looked in terms of odds ratios? It's almost as bad as smoking.
Right.
So anyway, that I think is an area that I've really tried to prioritize.
And it sounds like you also make it a priority to get out into nature and do stuff with your family. Like, again, I think it's just so awesome that you got your daughter to go on a 21-mile hike with you. Like, I mean, that's fantastic, right? And that's part of that connection with the world around you, but also these personal relationships and nurturing them.
Yeah, and then and the quality time of that versus, say, we're at home both on our phones, right? Or it's
exactly.
like, we're very connected and looking out into distance instead of being so close to a screen. And then, we're exercising and getting sunlight exposure. So I'm super biased because I like hiking, but I think it's one of the best exercises and way to connect with other people. Because as men, it's hard to just be like, hey, let's go talk about the latest Netflix love show. It's like men need to do stuff together.
Yeah.
And so part of that is just like hiking, getting or doing woodwork or paddleboarding. Men need to come together over activities. And so I do think for guys, it's good to have a workout buddy or a hiking buddy or a hunting buddy, whatever it is, just to get out and do stuff. Because otherwise, we don't really, or it's going to the bar. And I think that's unhealthy.
Right. That's not the best way to get your connect pillar in shape.
So that's how, unfortunately, a lot of men, and you look at the data on men, they don't live as long. They have higher rates of all sorts of different diseases and conditions. So, because I think the way they socialize is over alcohol and fast food and stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's a generalization, but I agree with you. I mean, I think there are reasons why these sort of generalizations arise is because there's some truth to it. And certainly, in my own life, kind of the same thing. I think I recognize that, if I had to pick a pillar, that's the one that I, in the absence of some intentionality, would be weakest in.
Yeah. Right. And so that one takes the most work, but go back to the food thing, realizing that in my perspective, and if you look at the data, humans were omnivores. You look at the radioisotope imaging data, dental enamel, we've been eating lamb and sheep and big game, as well as plant-based foods. And so trying to eat within, try to have seasonally available food that I could find within a 150-mile radius of where we live. And try to eat in an ancestral way, got into sourdough bread making, we're talking offline. I think there's a lot of zealotry in the diet space. All carbs are all bad, or plants are going to kill you. I think eating a wide range of healthy whole foods that you can make and that humans have historically eaten makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, again, don't want to suggest that that's a one size fits everyone, but I think for most people, it's hard to go wrong if you take that strategy.
It is. And you might have someone who's morbidly obese or has diabetes. In that context, a really strict low carb diet might be really helpful. Or someone has a plant-based diet in this context. So there's a lot of nuance there, but the ultimate goal would be to tolerate healthy whole foods that are unprocessed, and eating an omnivorous style diet.
All right. So I'm half joking, but I took a lot of heat from this because I actually made a half joking comment. What do you think of bananas?
I had one, yesterday. I like them. Yeah,
I like bananas too. I said, again, half joking, that bananas are Snickers bar masquerading as a fruit. People didn't like that, but they do cause a glucose spike. But again, it's better than a Snickers bar. But what are your thoughts again? I think actually this is interesting, right? Because there are obviously whole foods that would fall under that bucket as being generally healthy for most people.
Sure.
But as you said, if you're metabolically challenged, if you have diabetes, it may be the case that until you get that metabolic dyshomeostasis under control, some of these things like bananas may not be the best option among all the options that you could choose, right? What do you think about that?
Exactly. I think we should view carbohydrates in general and match our intake. It should be commensurate with our physical activity level and our metabolic health.
Right.
Just like, if someone has $300,000 in debt on their credit cards, should they go out and buy a $6 cup of coffee? Probably not. They should probably make their coffee at home. So if you're 200 pounds overweight, should you be having bananas and fruit juice for breakfast? Probably not. You have metabolic debt that you need to recover from. So that's the way that I generally view carbohydrates in that context. I said I had a banana yesterday. The context was it was post-exercise. I had already done, a bike ride and a walk and then went to the gym. So it was like, I want to replenish glycogen because today I'm going to do a VO2 max test right here at Optispan. So that was my context.
Got it.
Same with sourdough bread. It's like we make sourdough bread before we do a 21-mile hike, so like we have it in the car, we have it snack, like it's great. But if I was sitting and only getting 2,000 steps a day, I'm not going to be having a bunch of sourdough bread because I don't want to wear it, So I think we need to, again, just reconceptualize how we view food as a fuel source and based upon our activity level.
Yeah, I think that's great context.
Yeah, so.
All right, so that's food. We talked about connect, exercise. What's your we already talked a little bit about your exercise, right? Kind of mix of cardio. You do resistance training regularly. Anything to add to that, or
that just daily step count? I think is really important.
Okay.
It's great to have these recreational sort of scheduled exercise sessions and going to the gym, doing HIIT training or yoga or whatever. But if we're not just walking, at least 6,500 steps per day. So this was Edward Coyle at UT Austin has done a bunch of different studies where they randomize people to only have 2,000 steps or up to 6,000 steps, and then look at their post-meal fat oxidation and triglyceride levels. Even after doing a steady state 60-minute exercise session, people who don't walk are just not burning fat during recreational exercise. Mm-hmm. So, we know a lot of people that go to the gym and they're doing all this stuff, but they're sitting on a computer all day long. So we need to bake in exercise snacks throughout the day.
And that's what I was going to say. Do you think it matters whether you get all of your steps in one setting, or does it have to be kind of spread throughout the day?
I think we need to sprinkle it in throughout the day. So for example, I'm already at 4,800 steps. It's 11 o'clock. So I walked my daughter to school. We parked and then walked and all that. And then later on tonight, I'll do another walk. So I think sprinkling it in, and this is actually pretty good data going back almost 10 years now, finding that even if people like marathon, because we hear about this, Joe, the marathon runner, dropped out of a heart attack at 50.
Yeah, right.
Sat at the office all day. Maybe in the morning, Joe or Sally would do an hour run, but then if you sit all day, that's really problematic. So we need to sprinkle this in. And so you don't need to do as much structured exercise if you are moving around all the time. I have family members that are blue collar and they move all the time. They look shredded in their 70s because they're just moving so much throughout the day.
There's lots of ways to accomplish it. What I was going to say, though, is I think, and to the extent that you can combine it with, like you said, walking your daughter to school, right? Combine it with other things that are going to have a positive impact on your health. Getting outside, walking outside, right? That's great, right? If you can knock off a couple of two birds with one stone, so to speak.
Totally. Take the Zoom call outside. Just get some headphones and go for a walk. I often take calls when I'm walking. So I think it sounds intimidating for people. Oh my gosh, 6,000 or 9,000 steps per day. The meta-analysis by Bannock et al. Clearly show that we need 9,000. The threshold and reduced odds ratios for sleep apnea, diabetes, gastric reflux issue, depression. 9,000 steps was linked across a bunch of different studies, lower odds of all these common conditions. Yeah. So if we can aim for that, that's ideal.
Yeah, and I mean, I get it is intimidating to people, especially if you're very, very sedentary. But it's like a lot of other stuff. You don't have to start at 9,000, right? Just start developing habits, and over time, you're going to realize pretty quickly, well, that's actually not that big of a deal. It's not that hard. But you need to get there, and really it becomes about developing new habits so that it isn't a burden. It's just part of what you do.
Totally.
Yeah.
I agree.
Cool. Sleep. That's the last one we haven't touched on yet.
Yeah, really important. I think, the duration and, in my opinion, light exposure. So getting TVs out of the bedroom, getting iPhones out of the bedroom. There was
habits, like we were saying,
small little things, because just having that phone, like if you and I were talking right now, having the phone right there would distract both of us unconsciously. So if it's right on your bedstand, you're gonna be thinking, if you have to get up to go pee, you're gonna check your email, you're gonna look on Instagram. So just get out of the bedroom. There was I think Stanford University put out this consensus statement paper on how much light we need during the day and how much darkness we need at night to optimize just whole body health. So during the day, we need more than 1,000 lux, and you can download an app for the photometer on your phone, or I got a cheap one, $29 on Amazon. Look at your light hygiene at home. In the hour before bed, you want less than 50 lux. In the bedroom, you want as close to 0 as possible. And so if you just I was looking at my phone with my light meter before bed, it's 70 lux. This is way more light exposure than is health promoting, because that light will, as you know, augment melatonin release and affect our whole circadian clock, which does affect sleep quality, sleep duration. So I think light hygiene at night is really important, light in the morning, and then how we're breathing while we're sleeping. And I know this sounds a little wacky, but just like we talked about with diabetes, we're all on a spectrum with sleep apnea as well. So we have normal nasal breathing while sleeping, and then we have full-blown apneic events. Some of us are in the middle, myself included, having sleep disordered breathing. Didn't have sleep apnea, but would periodically snore, have a dry mouth, and breathing through my mouth while I'm sleeping, and that's problematic.
How did you find out?
It was a podcast like this with a friend of mine, Mark Brehenna, who's a dentist, sleep disordered breathing specialist. He makes dental appliances for people of all walks of life, premenopausal women, postmenopausal. He finds this is really, really common, sadly, in our society. He half-heartedly joked after the podcast. We talked about the importance of nasal breathing and in the context of facial development for kids. My daughter at the time was doing the MyoBrace, and that's a technology to really help with jaw development and maybe offset the need for braces down the road. He said, yeah, and another thing you can do is mouth taping. All of our family does it. You just get 3M micropore and tape your mouth shut before bed. And I thought he was joking because he had said, even my in-laws do it now. And I thought, oh, he doesn't want to hear from his in-laws. He's like, no, I'm serious. I'm like, really? So I went to Walgreens, got 3M micropore tape that night, put it on, and had vivid dream recall of all of my REM sleep, like in a way that I hadn't experienced in a long time. Felt so refreshed, and I thought, holy crap. Yeah, this is like the most amazing lifestyle. I've done a lot of like little hacks and tricks over the years. This was profound.
Interesting.
And then so I started making videos on it, and like
do you still do it?
I do every night. Yeah. Wow. Even in the backcountry when I do 21-mile hikes and camping, I have my little 3M micropore tape there. And so just taping your mouth and the neurology of it. I mean, it sounds silly. Like, how could taping your mouth actually improve your sleep? When we are sleeping, our brain temporarily paralyzes our muscle tissue at different regions of the body. And if that happens to your tongue when you're breathing through your mouth, your tongue is completely collapsing your airway and you're having an apneic event.
Right.
And we know that sleep apnea creates increased secretion of cortisol. We talked about oxidative stress in the context of LDL cholesterol. Well, it's a very pro-oxidative stress forming environment, having periodic suffocation episodes. Right. So when you take the tongue out of the picture, because you're forced to breathe through your nose when you're sleeping, you're not having those apneic events, and you're just having uninterrupted sleep. A common symptom is actually frequent night urination or overactive bladder. A lot of people would just point to the bladder, but it's actually linked with sleep disordered breathing. So, and I found this with my clients over the years. Like I really go to bed at 9. I don't eat past 6. I'm doing all these things, no caffeine. Then I wake up to pee at 3 in the morning. I'm like, do you wake up with a dry mouth? Yeah. Do you snore? Yeah. My wife actually has to sleep in the other bedroom because I snore so much. Okay. We might have sleep apnea or sleep disordered breathing. Have you tried mouth taping first? Then look at a sleep study. Work with someone who can analyze this. But oftentimes, if the spouse hears snoring or these little a lot of people pop if they're mouth breathing, that's a symptom of sleep disordered breathing. So there's all kinds of appliances. I'm not saying that mouth taping is the cure. It's a solution to.
Yeah, maybe worth trying if somebody's experiencing any of these symptoms for sure.
Yeah.
I'm going to go home and try it.
Sweet.
I've got my Aura ring on. So
there
I'll
you
see,
go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll see if there's any difference. The Aura says I actually sleep really well. My sleep score is usually in their optimal range, even when I don't feel like I sleep that well. So,
nice.
I'm not 100% sold on the accuracy of the tool, but nonetheless, I'm going to try this experiment. I think it'll be interesting.
And what I like about it with all these things we've been talking about, it's low cost. The tape, it's $11 at Walgreens. Right. Inflation, it used to be $7. but still, it's
when you're talking about investing in your health. It's worth
for a good night's sleep. I'll pay $7 a month or $11 a month all day long.
Cool.
So.
All right. So I've got my homework. That's great.
Heck yeah.
This has been fantastic.
Thank you.
So much
this was great.
Coming down, and now we're going to put you through the ringer. And
I'm excited.
We'll
a little nervous about the VO2 max test.
Awesome. So thanks everyone for watching the Optispan podcast. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Please be nice to Mike. We don't have to be hard on him this time around. If you're not yet a subscriber, hit that subscribe button, and we hope to see you next time on the podcast.